Hey friends, tonight we're cracking open a tale that's as ancient as the stars. But trust me, it hits with the unexpected punch of a midnight snack you didn't plan on, but somehow can't stop eating. Picture this. You're perched on an old chair that groans every time you shift. A lazy ceiling fan stirs the air above, and somewhere outside, an owl's call cuts through the stillness like a whisper from another world. This isn't your high school history class. This is gods throwing shade over fruit, forgotten betrayals that never made it into the textbooks, and moments so wild they make reality TV look like child's play. And yeah, you might want to brace yourself, because what's coming isn't just history. It's a ride through the strange, the sacred, and the straight-up surreal. So before we jump in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Only if you vibe with these late-night dives into the weird and wonderful. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you all are tuning in from. It's like we're sharing one long cosmic campfire. Alright, lights down, volume up, and let that hum of the fan settle into your bones. Let's step into tonight's story together. It starts with a smell. Thick, gamey, and slightly sweet. In that way, decay sometimes fools your senses. You wouldn't eat it now. Honestly, you probably wouldn't even walk past it without gagging, or at least giving it the wide-eyed grimace of modern food horror. But here's the twist. If you'd been born 800 years ago, that smell wouldn't have warned you off. It might have made your stomach grumble. You're standing in the smoky warmth of a medieval kitchen, and hanging from the rafters is a hunk of meat, stiff at the edges, dark with age, and definitely past its prime, by every modern standard. No cling wrap, no sell-by date, just time, air, and salt. And even then, not always. A wooden table nearby is streaked with old blood. A cat crouches by the fire, half asleep, pretending not to care. But you're here for dinner, and that meat is dinner. This wasn't strange, it was normal. The idea of rotten was more elastic in the Middle Ages, more forgiving, maybe because it had to be. Cold storage was non-existent for most people, and meat preservation wasn't about maintaining a clean, neutral flavor. It was about survival, about stretching the lifespan of something that would otherwise spoil within days. If it changed color or smell, well, that was just part of the transformation. You might even say it added character. Let's be real. Nobody back then thought, "Yum, give me the grossest hunk of meat you've got." But they also didn't flinch at the tang of aging pork or the fuzz at the edges of a roast pigeon. Meat came in shades of safe and not so safe, and you learned to judge by look, smell, touch, and the occasional family member who didn't make it through dinner. Okay, not that often, hopefully. Your medieval ancestors weren't trying to gross you out. They were just working with what they had. And what they had, let's say, was a refrigerator that looked a lot like the outside air, assuming it was winter, shaded, and didn't have rats. If it was summer, well, best eat fast. But even when meat was technically bad, it didn't always go to waste. There was a whole culture around stretching ingredients to their limits. Salt, vinegar, honey, smoke. These were the preservatives of choice. Not perfect, but helpful. And if something still turned, you might try boiling it into a stew, baking it into a pie, or smothering it in a suspicious amount of spices. As long as it didn't actively make you retch, it was still food. Now imagine sitting at a feast, yes, a feast, with a roasted animal in front of you. It smells interesting, rich, but also sharp. You can't tell if that's the cumin or the days-old duck, probably both. Still, you take a bite. The texture is a little soft. The fat is, well, aggressive, but it's seasoned with a hand-crushing amount of cinnamon and cloves. That wasn't dessert seasoning back then. It was meat camouflage, and it worked. Historians still argue whether people liked the taste of mildly turned meat or just got used to it. It's a fair debate. Some records hint at foodies who actively enjoyed the funky edge of well-ripened cuts, similar to how we treat aged cheese or fermented fish today. Others suggest the flavor was tolerated because the alternative was starvation, or at least a very monotonous diet of barley and sadness. Speaking of cheese, let's be honest. You already eat things that smell horrifying. Blue cheese smells like gym socks. Kimchi, rotting cabbage, fermented shark in Iceland? Yeah, you don't even want to know. So maybe medieval meat isn't that far off. The line between rotten and aged is blurry, and context is everything. Plus, in medieval Europe, meat wasn't everyday fare for most people. It was rare and precious. So when you got some, especially if you weren't a lord or landowner, you ate it no matter what. Whether it had been hanging in a cool cellar or sweating in a pantry with a single anxious mouse, you made it work. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was risky. Waste too much, and you don't eat next week. Of course, there were limits. Meat that crawled or bubbled or made the dog bark in horror. Yeah, that probably got thrown out. But something a little off? You could boil that down, bake it in a pie crust so thick it doubled as a food safe, or drown it in ale and call it sauce. Remember, flavor wasn't always the goal. Filling bellies was. And if it tasted odd, well, you just told yourself it was an acquired taste. Some nobles even wanted their meat gamey. A touch of funk meant age, and age sometimes meant class. The longer the meat had hung, the more refined it supposedly became. Because nothing says sophistication like a side of food poisoning, right? There's even evidence that some medieval cooks preferred meat that had started to ripen. Recipes included instructions for rehydrating dried meat with broth and wine, meaning yes, even after it had basically turned into jerky, they tried to bring it back to life like Frankenstein's roast. The goal wasn't freshness, it was flavor, or maybe just hope. This wasn't universal, of course. Rich or poor, people knew that truly rancid meat was dangerous. But danger was relative. And detection methods? Not scientific. If your family had always eaten a little lively venison and survived, you'd trust your instincts. Or your mother's nose. Or the local cook who claimed to have a feeling about when meat was safe. Spoiler, she was probably more accurate than anyone else. But here's where things get interesting. You're in the village now. You watch a boy carry a skinned rabbit through the square. Flies already buzzing. No one panics. No one screams disease. It's just Tuesday. The communal idea of what food should be was broader, softer, less pristine, and maybe more honest. Because for all our modern rules and sanitizers and digital thermometers, we've built a world where food is expected to look perfect. Glossy apples, pink beef, chicken that somehow has no smell. And yet, it's still food, just like theirs was. Just cleaner. You take one last breath of that kitchen air, thick with smoke, sweat, and the tang of something just shy of spoiled, and you realize, this is where dinner used to begin. Not in grocery aisles or sterile packages, but in the raw, messy moment where survival met the senses. And maybe, just maybe, you're a little impressed. You're still in that kitchen, and the meat is still hanging. A little stiffer now. Maybe the edges are turning black, but not like mold. More like leather left out in the sun. And right beside it, someone's grinding a mix of spices, working the mortar and pestle with the quiet rhythm of habit. The smell hits you next. Cloves, cinnamon, maybe even a hint of nutmeg. Not sweet, not exactly savory, just loud, overpowering. This is where preservation and flavor start to blend. You think spices are for taste, right? Salts for chips, peppers for eggs. But here, they're weapons. Culinary armor. Shields between your gut and the thing you're about to eat. And in the Middle Ages, those spices weren't just seasoning, they were statements. Salt was the foundation. If you had enough salt, you could dry and cure meat into toughness so eternal, it would outlive your next 3 pets. Salt pulled out the moisture, slowed the rot, and made something last weeks, even months. In fact, people sometimes bought meat already salted or smoked, then used it as currency. Salted beef was so durable it became a kind of edible coin for armies and sailors. If it didn't crunch like gravel, it wasn't done right. But salt alone couldn't fix everything. And that's where spices swept in like flamboyant backup dancers. Imported from distant lands, they were status symbols and taste twisters all at once. You weren't just adding flavor, you were adding prestige. In fact, the cost of certain spices rivaled gold. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, saffron, these weren't just pantry staples. They were luxury items, often locked away in spice chests and guarded like treasure. So when someone dumped an entire handful of spice onto a roast, they weren't hiding something, they were flexing. Sure, the meat might have been questionable, but if you could afford to bury it in nutmeg and coriander, nobody cared how long it had been hanging. The aroma would fill the room before the stench ever had a chance. Still, you have to wonder, did they like the taste? Historians still argue whether medieval people used spices to mask the flavor of rot, or simply to showcase wealth. Was it utility or indulgence? A desperate trick or a delicious tradition? Some evidence suggests it was both. Elite recipes from noble households often called for more spice than meat, suggesting showmanship was at play. But in the bustling kitchens of the working class, spices were rare. If you had them, you didn't waste them on bad food, you saved them for good meat or feast days. But even that gets murky, because sometimes the best meat was old meat. A little aging meant tenderness. A little funk added complexity. Think of dry-aged steak. Modern people pay top dollar for beef that's been carefully aged until it smells faintly of blue cheese and old ambition. So maybe medieval folks weren't just coping, they were cultivating. There's an old cookbook from the 14th century that casually recommends a fowl. If it be old or stale, then parboil it. That's not a throwaway line. That's a survival tactic. If your chicken's starting to resemble a science experiment, just boil it in spiced broth, skim off the floaters and call it gourmet. Problem solved. And speaking of boiling, medieval kitchens were masters of transformation. You didn't toss meat just because it went dark around the edges. You boiled it, stewed it, minced it into a paste, wrapped it in pastry, baked it in layers, or shoved it deep into a pie where no one would question the source. Pies weren't just meals, they were hiding places. If it smelled good and was crusted with enough pepper and clove, nobody asked too many questions. Even vinegar made an appearance. A splash of acid could brighten old meat or slow down spoilage, just enough to squeak past suspicion. It wasn't science, at least not the kind we recognize, but it was instinct. A nose, a taste, a judgment call, made by someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Grandma's version of, if it doesn't kill you, it'll probably be fine. And let's not forget honey. Sticky, golden, and surprisingly antimicrobial, honey was both preservative and flavor mask. A sweet glaze on a questionable ham could turn into festive. You might not trust the meat, but the honey never lied. You're starting to see the pattern now. Food wasn't just food. It was a puzzle, a performance, a tightrope between survival and sickness. And spices? Spices were the glitter that made it all look intentional. But before you roll your eyes at medieval seasoning choices, consider this. You do the same thing. Ever drowned a freezer-burned steak in barbecue sauce? Or smothered questionable leftovers in hot sauce and called it Tex-Mex night? Yeah, that's you. Standing in a medieval kitchen, pretending that scorched pork still counts as protein. Welcome to the club. Now picture the street market. A butcher's stall hums with flies. Meat hangs from hooks, glistening under the summer sun. There's no ice, no sealed packaging, no plastic wrap, just slabs, bones, and guesses. But right beside them, in sacks or jars or strange little cones, are the real treasures. Cloves that make your tongue tingle, pepper that bites, and saffron so precious it's weighed like diamonds. The meat might turn, the spices might distract, but together, they made something tolerable, sometimes even delicious. Because let's be honest, even in 1300, nobody wanted to get sick. They just didn't always have another option. You wander past the stalls, and a woman in a soot-covered apron calls out an offer. Rabbit pie, 2 days fresh. You pause. 2 days fresh? You ask. 2 days from when? She just grins. That's not a question you ask, not if you want dinner. It's hard not to admire the creativity. Modern food culture prizes freshness, but it also prizes artisanal aging. Dry-aged beef, fermented pork, funky charcuterie. You've probably had worse-tasting things at a hipster deli than the salted ox tongue currently simmering in a medieval pot. Rot and ripening, they're just flavors we've learned to name differently. You turn back toward the kitchen, the spice scent now stronger than the meat. That's how you know it's almost ready. If the meat still smells like meat, it needs more pepper. If it smells like a traveling spice merchant's caravan crashed into a fireplace, perfect. It's funny, isn't it? You set out to judge their food, maybe laugh at it a little, but now you're realizing they weren't disgusting, they were clever, desperate, yes, but brilliant in their own right. They didn't invent spice use as cover-up, they elevated it. They didn't bow to rot, they worked with it. Salt, spice, and decay. The unholy trinity of medieval flavor. Dinner's ready. You duck under a carved stone arch and step into the flickering glow of a noble's great hall. It's late. The fire crackles in the hearth, casting shadows that lurch along the walls like silent dancers. A thick wooden table runs the length of the room, groaning under the weight of silver platters, linen cloths, and roasted beasts you can't quite identify by sight or smell. This is no peasant's dinner. This is the elite feast, where the meat is more mysterious than magical, and the flavors are designed to overwhelm your senses, not clarify them. You take a step closer and catch it, the unmistakable funk of something that was definitely alive, a bit too long ago, and has since decided to audition as a biological experiment. And yet, no one flinches. The lord at the head of the table laughs, teeth yellowed and full of wine. His guests murmur in admiration as a servant presents what might be a swan. Feathers still on, beak lacquered with honey. Is it fresh? Not likely, but it's been roasted, dressed, and perfumed like royalty. This was theater. Banquets weren't just meals. They were social performances where everything from the cutlery, if you had any, to the course order was a statement. And nothing said, "I'm important," quite like eating food that only barely passed for edible, dressed up in spices, sauces, and spectacle. Here's a weird one. Sometimes the meat was intentionally aged. The longer it had hung, the more gamey, the more noble it was thought to be. You weren't just eating to live, you were proving that your refined palate could handle what others might toss in a ditch. A delicately rancid partridge, a goose with character. This was the haute cuisine of the court. Game birds were especially prized, not just for the flavor, but for the status they conferred. A pheasant that had aged until its skin looked like medieval leather, that's lord food. A freshly killed chicken, that's commoner fare. In fact, there's evidence some noble households waited for birds to ripen before cooking them, encouraging a mild decay for depth of flavor. Think of it like this. Dry-aged steak in today's steakhouses hangs in controlled environments for weeks, sometimes months. Why? To enhance the taste. And what does it smell like? If we're being honest, death in a tie, and medieval folks leaned in. They wrapped meat in pastry crusts so thick they acted like time capsules. Known as coffins, yes, really. These floury shells preserved the meat inside, preventing it from drying out, or at least delaying the inevitable. Once cracked open, the meat wasn't always pretty, but it was tender, it was hot, and it was buried under enough herbs to rival a modern spa. Here's where it gets strange, though. Not all of this was deception. It wasn't about tricking people into eating bad food. Often, it was about enjoying a specific flavor profile that included ripeness, just like how some people love blue cheese or fermented herring. The elite palate of the Middle Ages found something to enjoy in that earthy, gamey, just a touch too funky aroma. You sit down at the table, a platter arrives. What's on it? A pie crust crimped like the rim of a coin, steam barely rising from a center oozing with dark juices. You take a fork, or maybe just your fingers, because manners were more flexible, and you dig in. The meat is soft, almost shredded, spiced to high heaven, a little sour, maybe a little sweet, definitely aged. The guests aren't just tolerating this, they're reveling in it. They toast, they joke. One man snorts wine through his nose as someone tells a joke about beef so old it remembers the last king. You laugh too, nervously. Your modern stomach winces. But your medieval brain? It's intrigued. Even dessert had its quirks. Some banquet menus included dishes like meat custards or spiced meat jellies served between sweet courses. Imagine taking a bite of honey-drenched fig, then a spoonful of minced mutton suspended in gelatin. It was a roller coaster of texture, temperature, and trust. And the presentation? Utter chaos, in the best way. Meat might be dyed with saffron or beet juice, shaped into mythical animals or stuffed with other meats. You might cut into a pie and find a cooked pigeon staring back at you from the center, surrounded by minced hair and a boiled egg. Or maybe the pie explodes, literally. Some dishes were designed to be theatrical. Pies with live birds inside that flew out when sliced open. A trick so famous it even made it into nursery rhymes. Was it good? Sometimes. Was it safe? Often enough. Was it unforgettable? Absolutely. But this decadence had its darker side. While nobles gorged on meat pies filled with God knows what, the lower classes struggled for scraps. And while food might have gone bad on both sides of the social line, the rich had spices, sauces, and servants to manage the risk. The poor had boiling pots and hope. Still, the elite weren't immune to consequence. There are scattered records of food poisoning wiping out banquet tables like a vengeful spirit. One royal wedding in France reportedly ended with half the guests violently ill, not from the dancing, but from a tainted roast boar that had gone a little too Shakespearean. Yet somehow, this didn't slow them down. Every feast was a gamble, and the higher the risk, the better the story. If you could survive a 5-course meal of questionable bird, wrapped in questionable pastry, and still toast with mead at the end of it, that was prestige. Historians still argue whether noble palates adapted to the flavors of decay, or if it was mostly illusion. Were the guests genuinely enjoying themselves, or just too polite and too status-conscious to say anything? After all, no one wants to be the one noble at the table who admits, "Actually, this venison tastes like an old boot." There's another layer too. The cooks. Medieval chefs weren't hacks. They trained for years. They knew how to prepare aged meats in ways that reduced danger and maximized flavor, or at least neutralized the worst. Their reputations depended on it. A bad dish could cost more than a tip. It could cost a position, or worse. So while the food may sound bizarre to you, it came from expertise, not accident. These weren't people slapping rotten goose onto a plate and calling it dinner. This was art, alchemy, a dance of preservation, transformation, and presentation, all wrapped up in layers of social theater. And you, sitting at the table, start to understand. This wasn't just dinner. It was identity, power, confidence in the face of decay. To eat meat that flirted with rot was to master the environment, to bend the rules of nature and emerge victorious. A platter arrives with a roasted peacock. Its feathers are reattached. Its beak is gilded. Its insides are anyone's guess. You take a bite. It's awful. You smile. Because in the Middle Ages, that's the taste of luxury. You step out of the great hall, your senses still dazed from the onslaught of spices, feathers, and ambiguous gravy. Outside, the air is fresher, simpler, earthy. You follow a dirt path that winds down toward a row of crooked shops and stalls, and there, just beyond the muddy square, is the butcher's shed. Now this isn't the perfume pageantry of the nobles. This is where meat meets reality, real blood, real bones, real flies. You duck your head as you walk through the low doorway and catch your first glimpse of the butcher at work. He's an older man, thick hands stained red to the wrists, slicing into a side of beef with the ease of someone who's done it every day for the last 40 years. His eyes flick to you, then back to his work. Behind him, on the wall, hang hooks and blades, all variously sized and unpleasantly stained. You try not to stare too long at the pile of offal in the corner. It's still steaming. This is where meat starts its journey, and where the fight against rot begins. A medieval butcher wasn't just someone with a knife. He was part surgeon, part chemist, part detective. He had to know the animal's health, the weather, the speed of the kill, the quirks of the cut. There was no refrigeration, no clean stainless steel counters, no USDA inspections, just instinct and a nose. A good butcher could tell, just from smell and texture, whether a joint would last 2 days or 5, whether it needed salt, smoke, or stew, whether the customer in front of him could afford the better cuts, or would need the second best, which usually meant the parts already edging into funk. And yes, people still bought it. You stand back as the butcher guts a pig with a swift, practiced motion. He's already thinking ahead. This part will be salted, that part dried, the offcuts ground into sausage. The head might go into a soup. Nothing is wasted. Not because they're being noble, but because they can't afford not to. Even bones had purpose. Roasted, boiled, cracked open for marrow. If you're poor, you buy the bones for broth. If you're slightly less poor, maybe you get a little meat with them. If you're lucky, and early, you might score something that still twitches. The butcher pulls down a slab from a wooden beam and sniffs it. He shrugs. "It'll stew," he mutters. That's code for, not fresh enough to roast, but not dead enough to toss. Just right for hours of boiling, where flavor is coaxed from every cell, and suspicion is drowned in garlic and fire. You watch as a woman hands over a few copper coins and receives a string of sausages in return. They're pale, knotted, and glisten in a way that feels slightly menacing, but she beams and hurries off, prize in hand. You think back to your own experience with sausages, and suddenly that grocery store version with its nutrition label and expiration date feels like science fiction. See, medieval sausages were where things got creative. Meat scraps, herbs, blood, fat, all blended and pushed into animal intestines. Not just for flavor, but for preservation. Once dried or smoked, a sausage could last days longer than loose meat. And if something went off, you might not notice right away. A gamble, sure, but one with a decent win ratio. And then there were puddings. Savory versions, not dessert. Think of black pudding. Congealed blood mixed with oats, fat, and mystery bits. Packed tight and boiled into a firm, dark log. Sound grim? Maybe. But it was rich, filling, and used up the parts no one wanted. It was also cheap, and that mattered more than taste. You strike up a quiet conversation with the butcher. He tells you about weather, about how a few days of warm air could ruin a week's work, how flies could ruin a hanging haunch overnight, how winter was a gift and summer was war. He's lost whole sides of beef to a bad wind or a careless assistant. But he's also fed families with meat that, by today's standards, wouldn't even make it past the grocery store loading dock. He points to a lump of mutton already turning gray. "Tomorrow's stew," he says. You ask, "Is it still good?" He smirks. Good for what? There it is again, that sliding scale of edible. The modern world loves hard boundaries. Good, bad, safe, unsafe. But medieval food? It lived in the blurry in-between, and butchers were the front-line philosophers of that uncertainty. Historians still argue whether these tradespeople knowingly sold meat that could harm, or if their experience genuinely made them better at knowing what could be salvaged. Some towns had guilds that regulated standards, even fines for bad meat. but enforcement was spotty. Reputation mattered more than rules. If a butcher made someone sick, word spread. Trust was everything. So butchers developed sharp instincts. They learned how to spot sickness in an animal, how to avoid organs that might carry disease, how to tell when a slight smell was harmless aging, or a sign to start digging a hole, and yet nothing was certain. Everyone played the odds. You're reminded of a saying, common in some parts of Europe. If you don't die in 3 days, the food was fine. Comforting, right? You follow the butcher into the back room. It's cooler here, shadowed. Hanging from the beams are loops of dried meat. Thinner cuts, curled and dark like jerky. There's a smell, of course. Not rot, not freshness either. Something else, a savory ghost. You breathe it in. This is preservation by air. No vacuum seals, just time. The meat dries out, the bacteria slow, the flavor concentrates. It's the same logic that gave rise to Bresaola and prosciutto centuries later. The difference? These folks didn't always have a choice. Drying wasn't just about flavor, it was insurance. Sometimes meat was buried in ash or clay to slow decomposition. Other times, wrapped in cloth and stored in hay. Strange methods, perhaps, but each with its own weird success story. You're tempted to wrinkle your nose, but you've probably eaten weirder things out of a modern food truck. As the butcher returns to his block, you notice his hands again. Rough, stained, scarred. Tools, really. Extensions of his trade. He may not know biology the way you do, but he knows meat. He knows what it sounds like when the blade hits the bone right. He knows what good blood looks like. There's honor in that, and danger, because one wrong cut, one bad batch, one overlooked spot of green, and someone gets sick, or worse. But when food is scarce and options are limited, risk becomes a routine. Still, the butcher doesn't look anxious, just tired, steady. You realize this is the rhythm of medieval life. Caution wrapped in necessity. And for all the stories about rotten meat, it wasn't laziness or ignorance. It was resourcefulness, hunger, knowledge passed down, one meal at a time. The day winds down, the last customers leave, baskets full of possibility and peril. The butcher wipes his blade, hangs his apron, and gives you a nod. Same time tomorrow, he says. You step out into the dusk, stomach churning, but not from hunger, from understanding. That behind every questionable feast, every street pie, every sausage of uncertain origin, there was someone, like this man, doing their best with a world that didn't hand out easy answers. And as you walk away, you realize something else. You might not want to eat that mutton stew, but now you kind of understand why they did. You wake the next morning to the clang of church bells echoing across the village. The air is already warm, thick with the scent of damp soil and livestock. You stretch, yawn, and step outside, where a cart creaks down the lane, pulled by a sluggish ox and loaded with something wrapped in coarse linen. A buzz of flies follows in its wake. You already know what's under the cloth. It's meat, and it's not happy about the heat. Today, you're learning what fresh really meant in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, it didn't mean still pink, or cooled to exactly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It meant recently dead, as in probably today, maybe yesterday, definitely not last week. Refrigeration as you know it doesn't exist. Ice is a fantasy. Cold storage is a cool cellar at best, or a stream if you're lucky. And if it's summer, your only defense against rot is speed, shade, and salt, none of which always work the way you want them to. You follow the cart to the edge of the market square. There's a crowd forming already. People elbowing in to buy meat before the sun climbs higher and the flies get bolder. The butcher, different from yesterday's man, this one younger and louder, is lifting the linen to reveal a haunch of beef that looks, well, it has potential. The edges are already darkening, and there's a damp shine that doesn't scream appetizing. Still, customers are lining up. You notice people sniff the meat, prod it, Bargain fiercely. Everyone's trying to buy as early as possible because they know the clock is ticking. Meat isn't just food, it's a countdown. This is the rhythm of medieval life. Animals were often slaughtered early in the morning so their meat could be sold and cooked before the heat of the day turned it into a biological experiment. You either cooked it now, or you had to start thinking about preservation. Salting, drying, stewing, or else you'd lose it. Which means the word fresh wasn't about optimal flavor. It was about time. Fresh meant it hasn't turned yet. It didn't have a USDA label or a shrink-wrap surface. It had smell, color, and texture, and your ability to read those signs could mean the difference between dinner and disaster. Some people got around this problem by only eating meat right after slaughter, like immediately after. If a chicken was killed, you plucked it, gutted it, and had it in the pot within the hour. You didn't wait for it to rest or breathe. There was no sous vide, just fire. Sometimes that meant the meat was tough or didn't cook evenly, but that wasn't the concern. The priority was making sure it didn't go bad before it got to your plate. This made timing everything. Feasts were planned around slaughter days. Markets were coordinated with butchering schedules. Even the weather forecast, if you could call looking at the clouds a forecast, factored into your decision about whether to buy meat at all. And here's the kicker. If you were poor, you didn't get to choose the timing. You bought what was left, what others didn't want. That meant offcuts, organs, bones, and yes, meat that had started to slide into the uh-oh category. So you learned how to make it work. Historians still debate how dangerous these meats truly were. Some argue that boiling and extended cooking killed most harmful bacteria. Others point out that medieval people probably built up stronger gut resistance over time. Still others suggest that many deaths attributed to bad air or demonic influence were actually cases of foodborne illness, which honestly tracks. But in the absence of science, you used what you had, your nose, your stomach, and your ancestors' advice. If the meat bites back, boil it twice, goes one saying. Another warns, red to the eye, dead to the pie. You're not sure what that one means exactly, but it sounds ominous enough to take seriously. You wander through the square. A woman stirs a pot of something over a fire. Dark, bubbling, fragrant. She waves you over and offers a taste. You lean in. It's meat, yes, but the texture is almost velvety, soft from hours of cooking. You don't ask what kind of meat. You don't ask when it was killed. You just eat. Stews were a solution. They didn't just mask the signs of aging meat. They practically erased them. Long simmering times, strong herbs, and communal pots turned questionable cuts into reliable meals. If you had leftovers, you didn't refrigerate them. You just left the pot on the hearth, added more to it tomorrow, and called it perpetual stew. If that stew's been going for 5 days, congratulations. It's now your family's legacy. Roasting was trickier. It required fresher meat, more precise heat, and space you might not have. But if you pulled it off, it was a sign of prosperity. A whole roast at your table meant you had meat to spare, and guests to impress. Still, people took risks. A dried-out rabbit might still be roasted if guests were coming, even if it was slightly gamey. That just meant it had character, flavor, personality. Or more bluntly, at least it's not soup again. You lean against a wall and watch a boy carry a goose by the neck. It swings gently, head bouncing with each step. It's not butchered yet, but it will be soon. That goose might be someone's dinner within the hour. Or it might hang in a cool cellar for a day or two, giving it that aged touch nobles loved so much. If the feathers start to slip, it's probably time. Remember how in Section 2 we talked about spices? Well, here they come again. The moment meat starts smelling a little suspect, out come the cloves, cinnamon, vinegar, and wine. Not just for flavor, though that helped, but for distraction. It's culinary sleight of hand. If you're busy enjoying the spice, maybe you won't notice the sharp note underneath. It's not a perfect system. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Records from monasteries and manor kitchens tell of spoiled meat being rescued and re-seasoned, then mysteriously disappearing from menus for a while, likely after making a few monks violently regret that second helping. But more often than not, it was fine. Not delicious, not Instagram-worthy, but nourishing, and that was enough. Modern food safety has trained you to be suspicious of anything remotely off. A little smell? Toss it. Slimy texture? Toss it. Sell-by date 1 day past? Panic. But back then, people developed a range of tolerances, because they had to. Rotten meat wasn't ideal, but it wasn't a death sentence either, just a reality. And even when it did go very bad, people had one last trick up their sleeve, feeding it to someone else. A neighbor, a servant, a beggar. Brutal, yes, but also a grim reflection of a society that couldn't afford waste. So you sit, a little queasy, watching the morning's meat disappear from the market stalls. What wasn't sold will be salted or stewed. What wasn't salvaged might feed pigs or dogs. And what's truly past saving? That goes to the ditch behind the tannery, where even the crows hesitate. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but it's life. And you can't help but admire the balance between caution and courage, decay and resourcefulness, between eating now or not at all. You walk past a tavern where someone's already roasting something over the fire. You don't ask what, you just breathe it in. And oddly, it smells good. The sun's past its peak now, and you've wandered away from the village market, where the last bits of meat were snatched up or tucked away in cellars, already battling the ticking clock of spoilage. You're walking a narrow dirt path now, between hedgerows and the occasional startled chicken, toward a slightly larger manor house. Your host today isn't a noble exactly, more like someone with money and a name, the kind of person who dines with nobles but still remembers the taste of hard times. And inside that manor kitchen, perched on a stool with herbs in one hand and a cleaver in the other, is someone who might just upend everything you thought you knew about medieval cooking, because now it's time to talk spices. Again. Yes, we already met our flamboyant friends, clove, pepper, cinnamon, in the noble halls, where they help disguise less than fresh meats and elevate social status. But today we ask the question scholars still can't stop wrestling with. Did people really use spices to mask the taste of rotting meat? Or have we misunderstood the entire flavor game? Let's dig into the paradox. On the one hand, it seems obvious. If your meat smells off, dump half a forest of herbs on it and hope no one notices. That's how we imagine the medieval cook, armed with spice jars, desperately trying to outshout the stench of spoiled pigeon. But on the other hand, spices were absurdly expensive. Peppercorns were practically currency. Nutmeg had to sail halfway across the world before it hit your dinner. Saffron was worth more than gold. Why, then, would you waste these precious imports on bad meat, especially when you could barely afford good meat? Historians still argue over this, and the truth, like most things, is probably in the murky middle. You step into the manor's kitchen, warm and fragrant, and watch the cook at work. She's adding a generous amount of black pepper to a rabbit stew. The rabbit was fresh, killed just this morning. No signs of spoilage here. And yet she's reaching for cinnamon too, a bit of ginger, even a splash of wine. This isn't desperation seasoning, this is deliberate, controlled, a practiced performance that knows exactly how it wants to taste, and that's the key. For many cooks, spices weren't a mask, they were a melody. You weren't hiding rot, you were composing complexity. That rabbit stew? It's not clove covered because the meat is bad. It's spiced because that's how it's supposed to taste. To medieval palates, spice wasn't the enemy of freshness. It was the friend of flavor. There's a tendency to assume that medieval people had lower standards, or didn't mind the taste of spoilage. But their cookbooks, yes, they had cookbooks, suggest something more nuanced. Dishes were carefully layered, flavors were balanced, even texture was considered. The fact that they could mask rot didn't mean they always did. Sometimes the spice was the star. You lean over the pot and inhale. It's oddly inviting, sharp, warm, even a little sweet. If you didn't know better, you'd think you were in a Moroccan restaurant or an Indian home kitchen. That's the thing about medieval European food. It was spicier, more fragrant, and more complex than most people realize. Not bland, not boring, just different. So where did the "they use spice to hide rot" myth come from? Some of it's modern projection. We live in a world where food must be pristine, clinical, carefully labeled. So when we read about meat being spiced heavily, our first assumption is that it must have been bad. But it's a little like seeing someone wearing perfume and assuming they're covering up body odor. Sometimes, sure, but most of the time, they just like the smell. There's also a class element here. The idea that nobles used spices to hide decay feeds into our desire to knock them down a peg. They may have been rich, but at least we don't eat spoiled duck wrapped in saffron crust. It makes us feel better. But the reality? Their food was often better preserved, better cooked, and intentionally seasoned. Not out of desperation, but out of design. Still, there were moments when spices served a more defensive role. You sit down as the cook serves a slice of pork that's been braised in wine and laced with a suspicious amount of cinnamon and vinegar. It's delicious, but you do catch a slight tang underneath it all. Not unpleasant, just different. The cook shrugs. "It had been sitting a bit," she says, nonchalant. You nod. The spice didn't hide the rot, it balanced it. Because here's the truth. Not all decay is equal. There's gone bad, and there's going through something. A meat that's been aged a few days in cool air might develop new flavors, richer textures. Think of the way prosciutto or salami is cured. There's fermentation, sure, but it's controlled, encouraged. That's what medieval cooks were often working with. A wide middle ground between fresh and foul. And that middle ground, it could taste amazing, especially when combined with the spice roots of the day. The medieval world was globalizing, slowly but surely. Spices arrived from India, the Middle East, North Africa. They didn't just preserve, they transformed. Suddenly, your table wasn't just local, it was cosmopolitan. A bowl of mutton could carry flavors from 4 continents. Of course, that created a cultural divide. For those who could afford these spices, food became performance, identity. To have access to saffron was to say, "Look how far my influence stretches." To serve a pie dusted with cinnamon was to flex your trade connections. The spice wasn't about saving the meat, it was about elevating the host. But for the poorer folk, things were different. If you got your hands on a bit of pepper, you used it. Maybe to improve a rough stew. Maybe to revive a bit of offal that had started to turn. Maybe just to make the same meal you'd had 3 nights in a row taste a little less like despair. You weren't masking rot. You were masking monotony. You stand again and wander outside, where the herb garden lines the back of the manor. There's rosemary, thyme, sage, and parsley. These were the everyday spices, locally grown, widely used. These weren't exotic. These were functional. Thyme for digestion, sage for preservation, rosemary for scent. A medieval cook didn't need the Silk Road to season meat. She had her garden, her mortar, her memories. And for the meat that was past saving, no amount of saffron could rescue that. It went to the dogs, or more grimly, the truly desperate. So the next time someone says, "They use spices to hide the rot," you'll smile and know better. They used spices because spices were flavor, power, medicine, and sometimes, yes, camouflage. But more often, they were celebration. You close your eyes and you can still smell it. That mix of meat, cinnamon, wine, and earth. It's not quite modern, not quite ancient, just human. Dinner's ready again, and this time you ask for seconds. You wake to the distant tolling of church bells. Again. But this time, they're not just marking the hour, they're marking the day. Friday. Which, in medieval Europe, didn't just mean end-of-the-week weariness. it meant no meat, which meant fish, or at least whatever passed for it. You shuffle out of bed, stretch your sore legs, and follow the scent of smoke and brine toward the fishmonger's stall. The village smells different today, less like fresh kills and sizzling fat, more like salt, wet wood, and the occasional whiff of something questionable. This is how it always starts. Fridays, and in fact, a shocking number of other religious days, meant abstaining from warm-blooded flesh. Fish, being cold-blooded, got a free pass. So did whales, and beavers apparently, because someone argued their tails were fish-like. Yes, really. Welcome to medieval religious loopholes. The church wasn't playing around. The average Christian in Europe was expected to fast from meat, not just on Fridays, but also during Lent, Advent, Ember Days, and random saints' feast days. That could add up to over 150 days a year. More than 40% of your calendar was fish forward, whether you lived by the sea or not. You arrive at the fish stall, and it hits you, that smell, a mix of salt, decay, and something smoky underneath. The fishmonger is unwrapping slabs of dried cod, their surfaces chalky and hard as driftwood. Next to them, barrels of pickled herring bubble ominously. You smile politely, pretending your stomach hasn't just tensed. Welcome to the medieval fish market, where half the offerings haven't seen the ocean in weeks, and the other half smell like they were dragged in last night and immediately gave up. Still, people buy it. They have to. Religious obedience wasn't just expected, it was law. Meat on a Friday? That wasn't a cheat day, that was a sin. So you leaned into preservation techniques, salting, drying, smoking, pickling, and boy, did those techniques get tested. Let's talk about stockfish. It's dried cod that's been left to harden in the open air until it resembles a 2x4 with gills. If you've ever smacked a piece of stockfish against a table, you know it sounds less like dinner and more like a weapon. But once it's pounded, soaked, and boiled, preferably with something to soften the experience, it's technically edible, and during fast days, it was salvation in a splintery wrapper. Then there was pickled herring. Ah yes, the love it or hate it icon of medieval fast days. Packed in brine, sharp with vinegar, and layered with onions or spices, it was strong in both taste and aroma. Not exactly delicate cuisine, but it traveled well, and it kept. That was enough. You watch as a monk inspects a barrel with all the joy of a man deciding whether a cheese has turned into a philosophy experiment. He nods, pays with a few coins, and lugs it back toward the monastery. He knows what's coming. A week's worth of fish stew, fish mash, maybe even fish pudding. Yum? Here's the thing. This wasn't about luxury. This was penance, humility. You weren't supposed to enjoy it. In fact, you kind of weren't allowed to enjoy it. The whole point of fasting was spiritual cleansing through sacrifice. If your fish was bland, dry, and slightly suspect, great, that just meant it was working. But of course, people being people, they found ways to work around it. Historians still argue whether medieval fasts actually changed eating habits, or just changed how people talked about eating. The church forbade meat, but not rich sauces. So, imagine a Friday dinner of salmon poached in almond milk, saffron, and sugar, technically meatless, but still opulent. It was spiritual loophole cuisine, and the wealthy loved it. Meanwhile, the poor stuck with the basics: dried fish, porridge, maybe a lentil stew. The most unfortunate relied on whatever was left in the communal pot. If that happened to be salted eel tails from last week's shipment, well, that's your Friday blessing. And yes, eels were everywhere. They thrived in rivers, were easy to catch, and didn't technically count as meat. You've probably never thought about eating one, but for medieval peasants and monks alike, eel was cheap, filling, and absolutely standard. Baked into pies, smoked on sticks, even fried if you had the fat. Doesn't sound appetizing. That's the point. Fasting was meant to humble, not delight. Still, medieval cooks got inventive. Almond milk was a go-to substitute, used in everything from soups to fish sauces. It had a creamy richness and no guilt attached. And then there were faux meats, mock dishes crafted to look like roast beef or chicken, but made entirely from fish, grains, or legumes. Visual trickery with a side of piety. One cook, you're told, could carve a pike to look exactly like a roast boar. Why? Because even when meat was banned, you could still make your food look naughty. That way you could impress your guests and still keep your soul intact. Culinary sin cosplay, if you will. You wander into a small tavern that's serving Friday lunch. The menu: a sour fish stew, spiced more heavily than you'd expect. There's a hint of clove, maybe even some ginger. You raise an eyebrow at the barkeep. Imports, he says, with a shrug that means, don't ask where or how. The stew is warm, salty, a little bitter. The fish is soft, not quite falling apart, but definitely past its freshest moment. You chew slowly. It's not bad. It's just holy, literally. And while you eat, you listen to the room. Someone complains that the herring shipment was late again. Someone else jokes that last week's eel came with more teeth than usual. A monk mutters that he saw a servant sneaking lamb into the kitchen last Friday. Scandalous. Probably true. Because for all the rules, people bent them, or broke them, or pretended not to see them. There were fines for eating meat on fast days, sure, but also forgiveness, especially if you had the right connections. The church could be flexible, particularly if your tithe was generous. Funny how that works. But for the average villager, no meat meant no meat, and no meat meant creativity. You think about that as you finish the stew. Maybe medieval food wasn't always about what people wanted. Maybe it was more about what they were allowed, or what they could keep, or what they could get away with. Even the most devout still wanted to eat something warm, something filling, something familiar. And if that meant salted eel 3 times a week, so be it. You step outside into the afternoon haze, belly full, mind spinning. The village smells of smoke and fish, and you realize it always will, at least on Fridays. It's not the most glamorous cuisine, but it's honest, resourceful, real, and somewhere, beneath the brine and bones, it tells a story of devotion, survival, and a deep, ancient need to find comfort in the things we're told to endure. The next morning, you follow the scent of smoke and stew down a narrow, uneven path toward the edge of the village, where small cottages press close together, like old friends trying to stay warm. No noble banquets here, no gilded birds or saffron glazes, just soot-streaked walls, thatched roofs, and the slow rhythm of peasant life. Your stomach rumbles. It's breakfast time. Or whatever counts as breakfast when you're a medieval peasant. Spoiler, it's not bacon and eggs. You duck through the crooked doorway of a tiny kitchen and step into warmth. A pot bubbles gently over a low fire, and a woman stirs it with a wooden ladle that's probably older than you. This is peasant food. Rustic, basic, endlessly repetitive, but somehow deeply comforting. The stew in the pot is thick with lentils, wild herbs, bits of root vegetables, and, yes, a few small scraps of meat. Or at least something that used to be meat. You eye the grayish lump floating near the top. It's stringy, soft, and completely indistinguishable. But here's the thing, it smells good. Not gourmet, but warm, herbal, alive. In medieval homes like this, meat was a luxury, not a centerpiece, a condiment, a memory. A thing you stretched like gold leaf across the top of your meal, even when it was barely enough to change the flavor. You didn't serve meat. You used meat, tiny bits, bones, scraps, to flavor everything else. This stew is a perfect example. It's been cooking for hours, maybe days. You take a sip and it's rich, earthy, a little smoky. The meat? Honestly, you could do without it. But that hint of fat, that tiny contribution from a bone boiled twice, gives it a depth no turnip could ever provide. The pot never really empties. This is perpetual stew, the medieval slow cooker. You just keep adding to it. Throw in today's carrot, tomorrow's onion, last week's pork scrap, and it keeps going. The flavor deepens, the texture thickens, and every bowl carries the memory of meals past. It's a way of cooking that's more than just economical. It's philosophical. Nothing is wasted. Everything is shared. Even if that everything includes a chunk of meat that might have once looked suspicious, but now just melts into the broth like it was always meant to be there. You glance around the kitchen. There's a slab of something hanging in the corner, loosely wrapped in cloth. You're not quite sure what animal it came from, or how long it's been there, but the woman gives it a nod of approval. Still good, she says. You decide not to ask how she knows, because here, rot isn't a horror story. It's a question of degrees, of timing, of tradition. A slightly funky joint of pork, that's flavor. A greasy scrap of goose with a darkened edge. Into the stew it goes, the fire will sort it out. Historians still debate how much bad meat medieval peasants actually consumed. Some argue that poor folks ate mostly plant-based diets by default, and meat, when it appeared, was too valuable to waste, too small in quantity to rot. Others suggest that the lowest classes got the worst scraps, old, stringy, and definitely a little off. Either way, one thing's clear. People knew how to make it edible. The tools were simple: clay pots, iron kettles, wooden spoons, no timers, no thermometers, just smell, feel, instinct. You didn't need a degree to know when the meat had turned. You just needed a grandmother with strong opinions and a sharper nose than most dogs. And while nobles had saffron and pepper, peasants had garlic, onions, leeks, and wild herbs picked from hedgerows. They used vinegar for sourness, stale ale for depth, and plenty of smoke, both from the fire and from pre-smoking certain meats to keep them usable a little longer. You take another bite of stew. There's a chewiness to it. You're not sure if that's the barley or something that used to moo. Either way, it's satisfying, simple, and you get why someone would eat this every day. Not because it was exciting, but because it worked. You walk outside into the midday light and spot another household. Same setup, same stew. Slightly different vegetables, maybe a different bone, but the same logic. Stretch everything, use everything, flavor everything, even if the thing adding flavor is technically past its prime. Children play nearby with sticks and scraps of cloth. An old man sharpens a knife beside a small coop. Inside, a chicken squawks once, then goes quiet. Fresh meat is on the menu, but not for everyone. That chicken will probably feed 5 people tonight, maybe 6, and any leftovers, into the stew. Later, as the sun begins to dip, you're invited to another home. This one's a little better off. The stew has more meat, more herbs. Still no plates, just shared bowls, hunks of rough bread, and fingers, always fingers. The meat here is clearly older, tougher, but no one says a word. It's been boiled for hours, flavored heavily with thyme and something sharp. Maybe vinegar, maybe wine that went sideways a few months ago. Still, it works. You chew, you swallow, you smile. Because here, the point isn't freshness. The point is filling. The point is making something from nothing. The point is community. The kitchen glows with firelight. And as someone adds more scraps to the pot, you realize this stew is eternal. It doesn't care about spoilage dates. It doesn't know what expiration means. It lives as long as you keep feeding it. It evolves, adapts, survives, just like the people who cook it. The sun has dipped low, casting long shadows across the cobbled edges of town. You follow a new sound now, not the hush of a hearth fire or the lazy bubbling of peasant stew, but the lively clatter of feet, laughter and shouting. Welcome to the medieval market square at twilight, where the day's commerce melts into something much more intriguing. This is the world of street food. And let's be honest, this is probably where you'd be drawn first if you lived here. Why cook at home when there's hot food just steps away, served with a side of gossip and maybe a little edible danger? The smells hit first. Sizzling fat, burning wood, spices, and, wait, is that sausage? You trail the scent to a small stall, crammed between two alehouses. There's a woman behind the table, apron dark with years of grease, tending a shallow pan over open flame. She flips small coils of meat with practiced ease. They hiss, they pop. They release an aroma that's almost inviting. Almost. You take a closer look. The sausage is pale, too pale, a little squishy, but the surface is golden and crisped from the fire, so it might be fine. Might. Here's the game. Street food was always a gamble. The stall keepers were masters of thrift, turning yesterday's scraps into today's profit. That sausage? It could be anything. Leftover mutton, pig snout, lung, fat, breadcrumbs, maybe even the unsold offal from a nearby butcher, all ground together, seasoned to near suspicion, and packed into intestines, or, in lean times, paper-thin stomach linings. Sounds horrifying? You've probably eaten worse at a questionable gas station after 10 p.m. People loved street food for the same reasons you do now. It was fast, hot, cheap, and didn't require dishes. It tasted better than it should have. It filled you up. It let you pretend, just for a moment, that you were doing better than you were. You watch as a boy buys 2 sausages and runs off, one already half-eaten. A dog follows him, optimistic. And behind the stall, the woman reaches for a new link. This one's slightly shinier. That could mean it's fresher, or greasier, or don't ask. Historians still argue whether medieval street vendors knowingly sold spoiled food. Some say yes. There were no regulations after all. Others point out that in a small village, a bad sausage was remembered. If you poisoned someone, you lost business, or worse, you got run out of town, so most vendors developed instincts. They learned how long something could sit out, when to reheat, when to stir in more vinegar or wine, when to add more onion or sage. They didn't have thermometers, but they had survival on the line. You move on to another stall. This one is selling meat pies. Glorious little golden packages of mystery. You bite into one. It's warm, peppery, soft. You don't ask what's inside, but if you had to guess, it's somewhere between last week's chicken and today's goat. Still, it tastes kind of amazing. This is the power of crust. A good medieval pie crust wasn't meant to be eaten. It was thick, tough, more like a baking dish than a pastry. It sealed in meat, kept air out, and extended the food's life by days. Once opened, the filling might smell a little strange, but add enough spice, and no one cared. Some pies were so well sealed they could be transported across cities. One noble reportedly sent pies as gifts, sealed, spiced, and potentially well past fresh by the time they arrived. But no one complained. It was the gesture that mattered. The flavor was negotiable. You pause at a barrel set beside a tavern where a man is selling skewers of roasted meat. He claims it's lamb. It smells sweet. Too sweet. You take a bite. It's chewy, vaguely metallic. You chew slower. Is that honey? Another trick of the trade. Sweet sauces to cover suspect meats. Sugar was expensive, sure, but honey was more common, and a thin glaze could turn a borderline piece of meat into a delicacy. Add a little wine or ale, and boom, now you're not hiding rot. You're celebrating rich, fermented undertones. You wipe your mouth and drift toward a fire pit, where something much larger turns on a spit. People gather, hands outstretched for warmth, and for food. The meat is dark, the skin crackled. You get a slice, it's gamey, a little tough, but not bad. Probably deer, or boar, or, well, it's better not to know. Street food wasn't about safety, it was about possibility. You might get something incredible. You might get something that leaves you praying to 5 different saints. Either way, you got a story. And let's not pretend modern street food is immune. Ever had a burger from a truck that's been sitting under the sun since noon? Exactly. You're still playing the same game, just with better PR. You stop at a low wooden bench where a man is drinking ale and devouring a thick stew from a wooden bowl. He offers you a spoonful. It's hot, salty, and full of beans, bits of mystery meat, and more garlic than anyone should reasonably use. You nod in approval. He grins. "Boiled it twice," he says, "just to be sure." That phrase again, boiling as the universal solution. In a world where meat could go wrong in a matter of hours, heat was your last line of defense. A long boil didn't just soften tough meat. It neutralized issues, or at least convinced you that it did. Even the ale served with these meals played a part. Weak beer was safer than water after all, and the alcohol helped kill off any lingering regrets from the sausage you ate an hour ago. You linger as the sky darkens, fires crackle, and more food sizzles in the shadows. There's something oddly beautiful about it. This chaotic, fragrant, slightly suspicious collection of meat, spice, and improvisation. It's a cuisine born not of luxury, but of necessity with flair, a type of edible optimism. Sure, some meals went wrong. Some street vendors pushed their luck. Some sausages probably did turn before their time. But for most people, this was where food felt alive, loud, social, real. You get one last pie for the road, still warm, still mysterious. And as you bite into it, you think, maybe food doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe it just has to get you to tomorrow. You're full now. Pie crumbs on your tunic, the faint taste of mystery meat lingering in your mouth like a riddle half solved. But as the firelight fades and the market stalls close, the question creeps in. How did anyone know when to stop? Who decided when meat was too far gone? And what happened when someone pushed it just a bit too far? Tonight, you follow that question into the quieter side of town. Past the taverns, past the church, and toward the low stone buildings that house something rare for the medieval world. Rules. Welcome to the world of kitchen laws, food regulations, and failed enforcement. Because even in a time when most people didn't have last names, someone still tried to make sure your meat wouldn't kill you. You duck under a sagging archway into the local butcher's quarter. Even in the dark, it smells like iron, smoke, and something less poetic. Here, meat was prepared, inspected, and, believe it or not, regulated. Cities and towns had ordinances, guilds had rules, even kings had opinions. And it all started with the idea that too much rotten meat was bad for business, not just morally or spiritually, but economically. If people started dying from their dinner, fewer would come to market, fewer taxes, fewer tithes, fewer chances for the ruling classes to stay on top. So local authorities got involved, not always successfully, but often dramatically. You pass a posted list on a wooden beam. It's written in rough Latin and even rougher ink, but the gist is clear. No spoiled meat may be sold. If found, it is to be destroyed or burned. Fines will be issued. Repeat offenders will be banned. Sounds good, right? In theory. In reality, these rules were more like suggestions, heavily dependent on who was watching and who could pay the fine. Take the butchers' guilds. They existed in many towns and cities, especially in late medieval Europe. Their goal was partly professional pride, partly public health, and partly self-protection. Members swore oaths. They agreed to fair prices, regular inspections, and the noble-sounding task of ensuring the quality of meat for the common good. But let's be honest, a guild is only as noble as its most desperate member. And when the weather turned warm and half your stock started to smell funny, guess what happened? You sold it anyway. Maybe you minced it, maybe you salted it, maybe you called it something French, but it went on the block. Historians still argue whether these guilds truly improved public health or simply created the illusion of standards. Some records show butchers fined for selling meat not fit for dog nor man. Others suggest inspections were more about politics than safety. You imagine one of those inspections now. A local official strides into the market, flanked by guards, sniffing at haunches like a man who's never boiled a stew in his life. The butcher smiles too wide, offers a bribe thinly disguised as a gift, and somehow the suspect lamb shoulder passes inspection. You chuckle, some things never change. But it wasn't all corrupt theater. In places like London, strict rules were enforced, sometimes brutally. A butcher caught selling tainted meat might be fined, banned from trade, or even publicly shamed. One unlucky man was reportedly forced to parade through town with the rotten meat tied around his neck. A medieval version of Yelp, but with more maggots. In some cases, the punishment was more permanent. A handful of cities allowed for jail time. In extreme cases, repeat offenders could be exiled or worse. After all, selling spoiled meat wasn't just bad business. It was murder by marinade. That said, proving intentional wrongdoing was hard. Was the meat bad when sold, or did it spoil afterward? Did the seller know it was dangerous, or just think it needed more garlic? Without thermometers or lab tests, judgment came down to smell, texture, and a lot of shrugs. You walk into a tavern kitchen now, watching as a cook examines a slab of beef with practiced suspicion. He pokes it, sniffs it, slices off the greenest parts, and tosses them to the dogs. The rest, into the pot. "He'll sort it," he mutters. You nod. It's the medieval motto. There were other checks too. Town criers sometimes warned citizens about spoiled meat vendors. Monasteries had their own systems, often stricter, since monks had fewer options for forgiveness if someone died from dinner. Even markets themselves had rules about how long meat could be displayed. Still, enforcement varied wildly. A noble could get away with selling half-rotten deer to his tenants. A peasant caught doing the same might lose his livelihood, or worse, his head. Justice wasn't always blind. Sometimes it was just blinking very slowly. To be fair, some communities took it seriously. You hear about a town that set up a meat jury, a group of locals who would inspect meat before it was sold, vote on its edibility, and mark it accordingly. Democratic dinner in a way. You can't help but wonder how accurate they were. Probably more than you'd expect. After all, when your dinner might betray you, you learn to spot the signs. The sour tang, the sheen, the way the fat turns translucent, the butcher's nervous cough. These were the food safety systems of the day. But none of this could stop the rot entirely. Even with rules and guilds and angry bishops, meat still spoiled. And when it did, the blame game began. Was it the seller, the weather, the cook, the buyer who left it on the windowsill too long? One spoiled roast could trigger a week's worth of accusations, fines, and finger-pointing. Yet somehow the system held, mostly, because people didn't expect perfection. They expected food to age, to change. They expected the risk and weighed it. And when they felt cheated, they remembered. Reputations mattered more than written laws. As you leave the kitchen and step back into the cool night, you think about how today's food systems seem so sterile, regulated, controlled. But underneath, they still run on trust, instinct, and the fear of a stomachache. Maybe we haven't changed that much. You pass a notice board on the edge of town, where someone has posted a warning in uneven script. Do not buy from Willem's stall, foul turned, wife sick. No law, just advice. And that might be more effective than any regulation. Because in the end, medieval food safety wasn't about rules. It was about stories. Who got sick? Who got away with it? Who knew how to cook meat just long enough to get through the meal without regrets? You smile. And maybe, just maybe, you'll skip the sausage tomorrow. You wake to a softer sound this time. Not bells, not market shouts, not cleavers. Just birds. Somewhere nearby, a monk sings a low chant as sunlight filters through a stained glass window. You're not in a bustling town anymore. You're in a monastery now, where things move slower, where silence has more presence than people, and where, surprisingly, rotten meat becomes medicine. You step quietly through the cloister, past rows of herbs, wooden benches, and sleeping cats, until you reach the apothecary's room. The door creaks. Inside, it's cool and dark, lined with jars, flasks, and strange bundles, hanging from the rafters like forgotten dreams. A monk in a brown robe sits at a table, grinding something pungent in a stone mortar. You lean in. That smell, it's meat, old meat. This isn't a kitchen, it's a medieval pharmacy. And yes, spoiled or aged meat sometimes had a place here. Welcome to the part of history your science teacher didn't cover, where goose liver was dried and powdered to cure melancholy, where fermented deer fat was applied to wounds, and where the smell of rot wasn't always something to fear, but something to harness. It sounds absurd now, but in medieval medicine, the body was understood in terms of balance, of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one, or not enough of another, could throw your entire health into disarray. And meat, particularly meat that had aged, was believed to interact with these humors in complicated, sometimes curative ways. The monk explains with calm certainty. A slightly turned liver, dried and mixed with honey, might be used to treat chest pains. A small piece of aged beef, soaked in vinegar, could help draw out ill vapors from a feverish patient. Boiled marrow was said to restore strength. Even rotting flesh from animals was sometimes used to treat infected wounds, on the theory that like heals like. Historians still argue whether these treatments were symbolic, practical, or simply desperate. Did they work? Maybe. Sometimes. Placebo effect, spiritual belief, or just blind luck? Hard to say. But the point is, they weren't randomly applying moldy meat to people. They were following centuries of recorded experience and a logic that, however strange to us, felt entirely rational to them. In some cases, these ideas weren't entirely off base. Certain aged fats do have antibacterial properties. Fermented substances, though risky, can stimulate immune responses. And animal byproducts, gelatin, marrow, even bile, were rich in nutrients and used with precision. You glance at a shelf. There's a clay jar labeled Unguentum de Ursina, Pingadine, bear fat ointment. Next to it, a packet of dried meat strips, more gray than red. The monk explains it's to be boiled in milk, then drunk for melancholy. You try to hide your reaction. And yet, these methods weren't fringe. Monasteries were the medical centers of their time, and their treatments, however odd they seem, were considered cutting edge. Monks studied ancient texts, translated works from Greek, Arabic, and Latin physicians, and adapted what they could to their world. They recorded what worked, what didn't, what might work if prayed over long enough. Sometimes they treated the meat more than the patient. An especially temperamental piece of liver might be blessed, wrapped in herbs, even sung over before being applied. You wonder, was it superstition or early sterilization? Hard to say, but not all meat in medicine was used directly. It also played a role in diet-based prescriptions, where the type, age, and condition of your meat was tied to your health. For example, old meat, particularly game, was thought to be hot and dry in nature. That made it good for phlegmatic patients, but bad for those with fevers. Young meat, like lamb, was considered gentler. Fresh poultry, good for weakness. Aged beef, dangerous for women, some claimed, but excellent for old men with cold stomachs. One monk quietly tells you, a spoiled tongue can cool a choleric heart. You nod, not entirely convinced, but fascinated. There's also a small side debate raging in the margins of their records. Should meat be salted before medicinal use? Some monks swore by preservation through salt. It kept the essence of the meat intact, they said. Others argued that salt disrupted the natural balance and diluted the humors. It's the 13th century version of to season or not to season. You're handed a small vial of rendered goose fat, thick and yellowish. For stiff joints, the monk says. You can't help but think of modern pain balms and creams. Some things don't change, just the branding. And while most townspeople might have feared spoiled meat in their stew, here in the cloister, that smell might mean healing. The smell, that's the part you can't shake. You sniff again. There's something beyond just rot. something earthy, complex, like a mix of incense, damp wood, and thyme. It's not pleasant exactly, but it's not disgusting either. It's the scent of effort, of patience, of a different kind of science, built not on molecules, but on centuries of watching what happened when someone dared to try. And this wasn't just a European phenomenon. Across the medieval world, animal products and preserved meats were used in medicine. Camel fat in Arabic texts, fermented dairy in Slavic ones, fish paste in East Asian healing traditions. The global truth? Humans used whatever they had. And if it smelled weird, that didn't stop anyone. You watch as the monk gently applies a paste to a wounded traveler's leg. It's sticky, dark, and unmistakably meat-based. It draws the poison, he says. You don't argue. It's worth remembering that rot, in the medieval sense, wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was potential, a sign of transformation, of alchemy, of change. Much like fermentation, spoilage was a spectrum, and they had learned to walk it with caution and purpose. By now, you're realizing that the medieval mind didn't fear decay the way we do. Decay was nature. It was expected. What mattered was how you handled it. You could fight it, or you could use it. Sometimes you did both. As the sun dips lower, the monk smiles and hands you a tiny dried meat chip. Strength, he says. You don't ask what animal it came from. You just chew slowly. It's chewy, salty, oddly energizing. You nod in thanks. Outside, the world is still. Inside, knowledge lingers. Maybe medicine doesn't always need a lab. Maybe sometimes it starts with instinct, need, and a bit of rotting goose liver. The next morning, you wake in a small wooden cell tucked inside the monastery walls. It's silent, but the kind of silence that hums, like the world is holding its breath. Outside your narrow window, the mist clings to the ground, and in the distance, a bell tolls once. Not to wake you, not for breakfast. This one is for prayer. Today is a holy day, which means one thing, fasting. You stretch your limbs and wander toward the chapel, where monks kneel in slow-moving rows. Their robes sway like shadows. No one speaks, but you can hear a different kind of murmur, your stomach. You won't be eating meat today. Not because the butcher's out or the stew pot's empty, but because eating meat today would be a sin. Welcome to the weird, wonderful tangle of rotten meat and religious tradition, where abstinence becomes appetite, decay becomes devotion, and food isn't just sustenance, but a spiritual battleground. It's easy to forget that religion wasn't just about rituals and prayer. It controlled your diet, completely. More than any doctor, more than any king. The church told you what to eat, when to eat, how to eat it, and what it meant about your soul, and they were very specific. We touched on fish earlier, but it goes deeper than that. Much deeper. The medieval calendar was packed with feast days, fast days, vigils, penitential seasons, and random local saints' observances. Depending on where you lived, you might spend more than half the year avoiding meat. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, no animal fats. Unless, of course, the bishop said otherwise. And here's where it gets strange. Rotted meat, or more generously, fermented or preserved meat, sometimes snuck back in under the holy radar. You walk into the monastery kitchen, smaller today, quieter. No meat stew bubbling in the hearth, just fish, legumes, a thin gruel with a few mysterious flakes floating in it. But tucked away in a corner, you spot something curious, a hanging string of dried sausages, old stock, a monk says, set aside for Lent, not meat anymore. He smiles, and for a second you wonder if this is a joke, or just a very flexible interpretation of canon law. Historians still argue whether medieval monks really believed meat that had been aged, dried, or smoked long enough could somehow stop being meat. In some places, certain fermented animal products were reclassified as abstinent food if they'd been transformed enough. Salted fish stomachs, dried eel skins, even pork fat. So cured and aged, it was more mineral than meat. If it looked weird, smelled worse, and felt vaguely penitential to chew, good enough for God. But the line wasn't always clear. One monastery might allow fermented goat cheese during Lent, while another banned it as sinful indulgence. One bishop might bless dried goose liver as medicinal, another might burn it as gluttony in disguise. You're handed a small dish of something gray and jiggling. A Lenten pudding, you're told. It smells faintly of vinegar and bones. You take a bite. It's sour, salty, and somehow deeply spiritual. Because that's the thing, rot could be holy. When monks or nuns abstained from fresh food, they often embraced the opposite: aged food, dried fish, rancid butter, moldy bread softened with wine. It wasn't about flavor, it was about suffering. Each bite was a reminder of mortality, of Christ's passion, of humility in the face of bodily desire. In fact, the worse something tasted, the better it worked. If it made you gag, all the better. That was your pride dying, your gluttony melting away, your soul supposedly rising higher. You sit beside a young monk stirring a pot. Sometimes we add sour milk to the beans, he says. Makes them more filling. You're not convinced, but you nod. He continues. Once, we ate a crow that had hung too long. No one spoke for 2 days after. A beat. That was Lent, and while monastic communities had strict codes, peasants and townsfolk followed suit, often more by obligation than piety. Fast days weren't optional. They were law. Eating meat when you shouldn't could bring public shaming, fines, or even punishment from the church. So you got creative. In some villages, people fermented animal parts until they were unrecognizable, then claimed they weren't meat anymore. Others soaked scraps in vinegar, salt, or old wine, calling them pickled sacrifices, and insisting they were more about prayer than protein. One tavern, according to rumor, served a dish called saint's porridge, grain thickened with suet that had been left to ferment underground for a full season. The smell was, reportedly, spiritual enough to knock you sideways. And don't even get started on beaver tails. Remember that loophole? Because the beaver's tail resembled a fish, sort of. Church authorities in some places declared it was technically acceptable during Lent. So if you could catch a beaver, and good luck with that, you had a rare treat. Fatty, greasy, strong-tasting, and very, very permitted. Some monasteries raised them on purpose. That's not a joke. People built ponds and stocked them with beavers for fasting. Imagine explaining that to your modern dietitian. You take a walk along the monastery's garden wall, breathing in the cool air. There's no meat cooking today, but there are plenty of preserved things. Smoked herring, dried cabbage, sour cheese, stale oat cakes softened in ale, and behind all of it, that lingering idea, rot as refinement. Not in the culinary sense, in the moral one. Food wasn't just food, it was practice, it was trial. It was a reminder that the body didn't rule, that pleasure wasn't the goal, that decay could be endured, even embraced, and sometimes, in moments of true austerity, even enjoyed. A monk offers you a sip of warm, spiced wine, infused with herbs, cloves, and something stronger. You raise an eyebrow. Isn't this indulgent? He shrugs. Wine isn't meat, he smiles. Besides, it helps with the eel pie. You blink. There's eel pie? He nods, serious now. Fermented, been aging since Advent. You sip the wine. You nod. You decide not to ask any more questions, because in this world, the boundary between rotten and righteous is thin. Sometimes, holiness smells like vinegar. Sometimes, it tastes like dried fish skin. And sometimes, you find grace in a bite of something that's been hanging in the rafters since last harvest. You walk away from the cloister, stomach buzzing, head full of incense and salt. Behind you, a bell tolls again, this time for Vespers. Another fast is over, another chance to eat something real, but not too real. Something old, something sacred, something just a little bit rotten. The air is heavier now, not just from smoke or stew or salted meat, but from the unmistakable electricity of anticipation. You follow the sound of drums, laughter, and something else. Is that singing? Off-key, wild, and joyfully unhinged? Ah, you've made it just in time for carnival. This isn't the quiet reverence of the monastery or the orderly markets of meat and spice. This is the other side of medieval life. The upside-down world. The party before the penance. The feast before the famine. And if you think things were weird before, just wait until you see what they're eating now. You push through a cheering crowd and find yourself in a village square transformed. Flags flap above you. A man in a donkey costume is trying to dance. A child throws cabbage at a man wearing a fake bishop's hat. No one is offended. This is what carnival is for. Chaos in controlled doses. You look around and realize something wild. There is meat everywhere. It's being roasted, tossed, paraded, even juggled. Someone's gnawing on what looks like a pig's foot. A group of masked men carry a roasted boar on a spit while singing something about St. Anthony and flatulence. You don't understand the lyrics. You don't need to, because this is carnival carnage, and it's glorious. Carnival comes from the Latin carne val, farewell to meat. And farewell in this case is shouted, sung, and occasionally hurled into the air. It's the big blowout before Lent. One last chance to indulge in everything sinful, savory, and slightly suspect before the long season of fasting begins. And you know what that means. No holding back on the meat, even the parts you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot skewer on a normal day. A man next to you bites into what you swear is a fried sheep's ear. It crunches. He grins. You grimace. Carnival food isn't about freshness or refinement. It's about excess. You eat all the things you've been hoarding. You dig into the stuff that's been hanging in the cellar for weeks, maybe even months. And if it's slightly fermented, great. If it's fully fermented, all the better. You don't throw anything away, you celebrate it. Remember that goose liver dried in a monastery cupboard? Here, it's turned into a paste and spread on bread, while a juggler tosses sausages in the air nearby. That sausage? It's been fermenting in a pig's stomach for so long it might have become sentient. You take a bite anyway. It's sharp, funky. You blink, then take another. Because at carnival, nothing is off limits. One cook is deep-frying bones. Another is boiling ox tongue in beer. A woman offers you something she calls feast pudding, which appears to be part pastry, part intestine, and part performance art. And oh, the pies. Carnival pies are where reason goes to die. Layers of meat, lard, spice, and whatever didn't get eaten last week. You cut into one and find pigeon, eel, pork fat, a boiled egg, and, somehow, raisins. You chew slowly, surrounded by drumming and shouting. A man next to you howls like a wolf and throws a meatball at someone dressed as a bishop. No one flinches. Historians still argue whether this was just a feast, or something more subversive. Carnival was often about turning the world upside down. Rich people played poor. Poor people mocked their lords. Sacred symbols were twisted into jokes. Even the food reflected this madness. The parts of the animal normally hidden or discarded were suddenly center stage. You think back to the rest of the year, when rotten meat was carefully masked, salvaged, boiled beyond recognition. Not here. Here, they flaunt it. That slightly off pig's head, painted with honey and lemon and stuck on a pole like a trophy. That aged hunk of goat, sliced, skewered, and passed around like candy. You sit on a barrel and take it all in. A jester is slathering sausages in ale and lighting them on fire. A priest, probably not a real one, blesses a pot of boiling tripe. Children throw chicken feet at each other like snowballs. This is religion, yes, but through a lens of joy, rebellion, and meat-fueled absurdity. The philosophy is simple. Eat everything, waste nothing, and laugh in the face of Lent. Because tomorrow the fast begins, but tonight the rot is righteous. You try a pie filled with minced organs. It's oddly sweet, maybe honey, maybe just too much onion. It's hard to tell, you don't care. The drums get louder, The food gets weirder. You see a roast animal you can't even identify. You pass. Someone hands you a drink. It's thick, warm, and smells of both clove and garlic. You take a sip. It burns. Probably wine. Possibly soup. Who knows? The point is not clarity, it's celebration. And here's the secret. Carnival wasn't just about indulging in meat. It was about mocking the rules that kept you afraid of it. All year long, people tried to follow the laws. Eat this, not that. Boil that meat. Salt that fish. Pray before tasting. Apologize after chewing. But for this brief window of time, they let go. They didn't worry if the meat had aged a day too long. They didn't disguise the rot. They welcomed it, transformed it, and made it part of the joke. Because nothing says rebellion like a pie filled with liver and laughter. The sun sets, but the celebration continues. Someone lights a bonfire. Meat roasts over it. Sparks fly. A man in a pig mask runs through the square, waving a leg of mutton like a flag. You think of all the rules, the guild laws, the church bans, the whispered warnings about eating spoiled flesh. Here, none of them matter. For one night, meat is meat. No matter how old, how funky, how suspicious, it's all fuel, all joy. You laugh despite yourself. You chew. You maybe regret the second helping of ox tongue, but you keep going. Because carnival only comes once a year, and tonight rot tastes like freedom. You wake with the sun stabbing straight through a shutterless window, and a faint, smoky aftertaste lingering on your tongue. The square is quiet now, save for the occasional snore, drifting from an overturned ale barrel and the soft grunt of a pig rooting through ash. Carnival is over, the fires have died, the meat has been eaten or buried. And as you stretch, groggy and full of regrets, you realize something else is in the air. Division. Not the fun, chaotic kind from last night, the real kind. The kind that carves its way through kitchens, markets, and tables. Because in the medieval world, what kind of meat you ate and how rotten you let it get wasn't just about hunger, it was about class. You sit down beside a tired-looking baker, peeling yesterday's ash from a fresh loaf. He shrugs at your dazed expression and hands you a crusty end. Noble's probably still sleeping off that swan pie, he mutters. We got goose foot and soup bones. Then he winks. At least ours won't kill us. You chew slowly, crust dry and sharp as chalk. And he's right. Class dictated everything about your diet. It wasn't just about what you had access to. It was about what you were allowed to eat, what you were expected to enjoy, what kind of rot you could afford. For nobles, meat was identity. The more exotic, the more aged, the more heavily spiced. It all said, look what I can afford. Even when it was turning, especially when it was turning. Gamey meat, after all, was a status flavor. The longer it had aged, and the more dangerous it looked, the more refined your palate was supposed to be. You remember that swan from the noble's feast? The one that glistened with honey, but smelled like a barn fire in July? It wasn't served because it was fresh. It was served because it was dramatic. Rare, ridiculously expensive. It was peacock theater on a silver tray. Meanwhile, in the peasant world, meat was currency. Scarce, seasonal, and functional. You didn't age it for flavor. You tried to outrun the flavor. You boiled it, you stewed it. You hoped for rain, shade, a breeze, anything to delay the inevitable. And if it turned, you didn't call it gamey, you called it dinner anyway. Here's where it gets brutal. Rotting meat was distributed along class lines. When a deer was hunted on noble land, the choicest cuts went to the lord. The organs, hooves, offal, and all the bits bordering on suspect, that went to the villagers, if they were lucky. You visit a smokehouse behind a village cottage. Inside, strings of small sausages hang beside strips of jerky dry meat that look like leather straps. A woman tells you these are scrap sticks. Bits of leftover meat, aged until most people would call it ruined, then sliced thin and smoked until chewable. They say nobles eat fresh, she says, but we eat smart. You nod, though you're not sure chewing something that takes 20 minutes counts as smart. Still, she's not wrong. The lower classes didn't have the luxury to pretend aged meat was exotic, but they had the knowledge to keep it safe. Salt, smoke, vinegar, tools of the trade, and teeth. The irony? Some of the techniques used by peasants to make bad meat edible, fermentation, intense boiling, burying in ash, are now celebrated in high cuisine. We call it artisanal. They called it Tuesday. Historians still argue how much class impacted exposure to foodborne illness. Some suggest peasants were more vulnerable due to lower quality meat. Others argue that nobles, with their experimental dishes and riskier aging practices, suffered just as much, if not more. After all, what's worse, slightly off mutton stew or a decorative pie filled with 7-day-old swan liver? Even food laws were class-coded. Remember those meat regulations? They were enforced more strictly on commoners. A noble could serve spoiled deer and call it aged. A butcher who did the same got fined or flogged. You stop at a village tavern where yesterday's carnival bones have been turned into soup. It's thick, brown, and smells faintly of burnt onion and ambition. It's not elegant, but it's comforting. No one here is pretending it's refined. It just has to last. And that's the divide in a nutshell. The rich could afford rot with flair. The poor managed it with fire. You listen as a group of farmers trade jokes about noble food. One does a dramatic impersonation of a highborn lady exclaiming over herbed eel in rose water. Another groans and pretends to vomit into a jug. They laugh, not just at the flavors, but at the whole theater of it. Because flavor in the medieval world wasn't just about taste. It was a signal, a class handshake. The more expensive your spices, the more bizarre your ingredients, the more aged your meat, the further up the ladder you were climbing. And the most bitter twist? The poor were told to envy that, to aspire to it, to believe that eating something rotten and calling it refined meant you had arrived. But not everyone bought the illusion. You talk to an elderly woman on the edge of town, bent with age but sharp in the eyes. She remembers a time when her cousin served in a noble house. They'd eat peacock baked in sugar, she says, and spit it out in the garden after guests left. She laughs. Didn't even like it, just liked being the only ones who could. She offers you a strip of dried rabbit jerky. You chew. It's hard, smoky. Tastes like thyme and salt, and the kind of hunger that doesn't forget. And then there's the legacy, because even today, even now, you see echoes of that class divide. Fancy restaurants serve fermented meats, aged cheeses, organs and blood sausages. They drizzle sour vinegar over meat that's been hung for weeks, and we applaud, call it bold, complex, gutsy, but take the same dish, cooked on a hot stone by a shepherd with no shoes, and suddenly it's primitive, rustic, too strong, because rot, like everything else, has a brand. You stand outside the tavern now, stomach warm, brain full, smoke curls from chimneys, the butcher's back at his stall. The monks are singing in the distance, and the old rhythms begin again. The rich will feast on aged game birds and call it subtle. The poor will stew bones and call it survival. And somewhere in between, someone will smell a piece of meat, shrug, and throw it in the pot. Because when it comes to food, what we eat, how we rot it, and who gets to enjoy it, it's never just about taste. It's about power. The days have blurred together now. Markets, monasteries, kitchens, and carnivals, all woven with a common thread of salted meat, softening stews, and survival served with a side of skepticism. You've traveled from banquet halls to butcher blocks, wandered through the haze of incense and onion-scented alleyways, and tasted more varieties of rot than you care to count. But now, as the wind picks up and the village prepares for another quiet night, you find yourself back in a small cottage at the edge of town. A single pot hangs over a low fire. It bubbles slowly. The scent is subtle, onion, thyme, a hint of garlic. No grand feast, no rich spice, just warmth, just dinner. You pull up a wooden stool and exhale, because after everything, After the honey-glazed swans and twice-boiled sheep's feet, this is what remains. A simple meal, flavored by memory, made from what was on hand, and probably older than anyone would admit. And now, as your spoon dips into this unassuming bowl of stew, it's time to bring it all home. Because rotten meat, once the terrifying punchline to every cautionary tale, now looks a little different. It's not just about disgust anymore, or survival, or spice. It's about legacy. You look around at the modern world and realize the rot never really left, not in a bad way. It just evolved, got cultured, got gourmet. Think about it. You eat fermented sausages, aged steaks, dry cured hams, and funky cheeses that ooze and smell like medieval basements. You relish smoked mackerel, salt cod, and charcuterie boards that wouldn't be out of place in a noble's winter larder. You pay good money for flavors that ride the line between bold and questionable, just like your medieval ancestors did. Even in your fridge, you're still dancing with the same tension they lived with every day. How far can this go before it's too far? That container of leftovers? That wedge of cheese with the suspicious spot? The sniff test? It all echoes 1,000 years of the same question. Is this still food? Historians still argue whether we've become more cautious, or just better at disguising our rot. After all, the rules are still flexible. We pasteurize, we preserve, we age, we ferment. And with the right words, umami, dry-aged, authentic, we elevate what once made people gag into something that earns Michelin stars. The truth is, rot is just transformation, and every culture on Earth has its own version of it. In Korea, there's fermented skate. In Scandinavia, lutefisk. In Iceland, hakarl, rotted shark. In Ethiopia, injera made with sourdough-like fermentation. In Italy, blue cheeses that crawl. In China, century eggs with their rich ammoniated tang. The line between rotten and refined isn't scientific. It's emotional, cultural, social. You've just been trained to call it something else. And the flavors? They've stayed with us. That bite, that sour twist, that earthy undertone, it still speaks. It says, this was once alive. This almost wasn't food. But look at it now. That's not rot, that's resurrection. You finish your stew. The last bit is soft, savory, and just slightly smoky. It might have had something in it, some scrap from a week ago, boiled enough to forget. But you don't flinch. You just chew and smile. Because you've traveled through centuries of decay and come out on the other side not disgusted but intrigued. Maybe even a little awed. The people of the Middle Ages didn't invent rot, but they did learn to survive it, to dance with it, to flavor it, to live alongside it. And now, in your age of refrigerators and health codes and vacuum-sealed meats, you still chase that edge. You call it artisanal, rustic, bold. You call it flavor. And sometimes, late at night, when you find yourself eyeing a questionable leftover or a rind of cheese with more personality than your boss, you ask yourself, could this still be food? And now you know the answer. It always was. The fire crackles softly beside you now, reduced to gentle embers that cast flickering light on the worn stone floor. Outside, the world hushes beneath the rising moon. Even the owls are quiet, as if they too are settling into the warmth of a full belly and a good story. You stretch your legs, let your body sink deeper into the chair. Everything feels slower, softer, simpler, the kind of peace that only follows a long journey, a journey not just through history, but through hunger, instinct, resilience, and strange, strange flavors. You've seen the banquets and the bone broth, the spice caravans and the butcher's stall, the monks boiling goose liver, and the peasants stirring eternal stews. And through it all, there was one thread, thin, fragrant, stubborn, food that lingered just a little too long, and yet it endured, just like the people who ate it. So now, let your breath ease. Let the last scents of time and smoke drift from your memory. Picture the pot, hanging steady over the coals. Picture the wind carrying away the steam. Picture the silence returning to the room. You're safe, you're warm, you're full, not just of food, but of understanding. The world is older and wiser than you thought, and somewhere deep down, so are you. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of centuries settle like a heavy blanket over your thoughts. Let your mind wander, not to the rot, but to the resilience. Not to the stench, but to the spice. To all those quiet hands who kept stirring, even when the meat turned, because dinner still had to be made. Sleep now. The fire is low, the stew is done, and the story is complete.